Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I got a great question from a viewer the other day that fishes the Fox River in northern Illinois, and they said the problem they have is the river is full of silt. And I'm not sure what stretch of the Fox River they're fishing, but I have a lot of history growing up in northern Illinois fishing the Fox River, and I can vouch that it is full of silt. It is a very soft bottom river, lots of muck. Unless you're in an area that's got some actual pretty good current, you're gonna have some silt and muck on the bottom. And the individual said that they're struggling in that situation. So I've got some really good tips for you anytime you're fishing a silt bottom. Uh, because our lakes and rivers for the most part are silting in. Wave action, current, just runoff, that's all slowly filling in our lakes. If you go out and graph pretty much any lake in the country, what you'll find is the bottom of it is filling in with sediment. It's a soft muck bottom once you get down to a certain depth. And that will probably just continue over time. So, from that standpoint, silt and soft bottom areas are a definite scenario us as anglers will run into. And I've got some definite history fishing these scenarios, but just to give you some examples of anglers who have kind of conquered this. One of the first times I ever heard anybody really talk about fish not wanting to feed in silty areas was Brad Knight, who won the Forest Wood Cup on Lake Wachita. Man, I don't know what year that was. I'm gonna say that was probably 2015, so almost 10 years ago at this point. But he won that event by fishing the kind of an area where a river came in, a slow-moving river. It was a big flat. That flat was entirely filled with muck and silt, very soft bottom area, and there were some isolated pieces of wood. And he fished that area with a drop shot because, in his opinion, the fish did not want to eat baits off the bottom because when they go down to the bottom, suck that bait up, they get a mouthful of sediment as well. And his conclusion was I was getting a lot more bites from fish that wanted to eat high off the bottom. And it's really interesting because since that tournament, I have run into that scenario quite a bit myself. Like I've actually applied what I learned from him in that tournament, and I've heard a lot of other people mention it. One example this year was fishing at Santee Cooper. The first day I had was really not a good day, and I switched over the next day to a bait that was up off the bottom because I was fishing a sediment-filled backwater area, and the fish were much more aggressive eating a bait that was up off the bottom. And I attribute a lot of that to the fact that the area I was fishing it was a soft muck bottom, but it had this really fine black hairy substance. So, if your bait hit the bottom, it generally got some of that on there, but it was like the fish just didn't want to eat it off the bottom. So, using that information and using that knowledge, I think the most important thing an angler can do when fishing a silt bottom is to get their bait off the bottom. Now, I know in some circumstances you're not necessarily going to be able to fish a topwater or a vibrating jig or a fluke or something, right? That's up way off the bottom. In a lot of instances, those fish still are very tight to the bottom. They just don't want to eat down. They'd rather eat up or eat at their level. So, from that standpoint, I've got some pretty good tips for you that I've used to really enhance the number of fish that I catch in these areas. Before I do share those with you, though, I want to remind you guys that if you're looking to support the channel, please use my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link to make your tackle purchases. Also, I've got a membership with additional content, live streams, things like that. So if you want more content from me, check out my membership. All right. So the first thing, as I mentioned, Brad Knight won that Forest Wood Cup event on a drop shot. I think a drop shot is one of the absolute best baits that you can fish during or with a silt bottom. So if you've got a drop shot, you can vary the leader length to have your bait 6 inches off the bottom. You can have it 3 feet off the bottom. The point is you're able to keep your bottom off or your bait off the bottom. Your weight is still making contact with the bottom, so you can still feel what's down there. You can control the depth of your bait. And that would be my number one suggestion. So if you want to be fishing a jig, put the jig down and fish a drop shot. Another technique that works really well in these situations is a Carolina rig. But with the Carolina rig, I would go with a longer leader, something at least over 2 feet and all the way up to probably 4 feet, so a long leader. The longer the leader, the more your bait's going to separate and it's going to move up in the water column. Uh, I've had a lot of really good luck. The other nice thing again with the Carolina rig is you still maintain bottom contact. So a lot of these fisheries and the key places where you're going to be fishing are actually where that silt or that muck hits a hard bottom area, whether that's gravel, rock, a shell bed. So you have really good bottom contact with that. And it's though having that ability to know where your bait is in the strike zone is key. And a Carolina rig, as much as I'm not a huge fan of Carolina rigs, that is one of the times where I really do feel like they excel well. Now, if you do want to fish the jig or a bottom bait, say a Texas rig, my advice to you with that would be to pop the bait up off the bottom. Don't drag it, pop it. So, almost yo-yo your bait back to the boat. Generally speaking, in my experience, those fish in those areas want that bait off the bottom. So when you give it a wrist pop and get that bait to jump a foot off the bottom, that's when your bites are going to happen. One, the silt creates a good silt cloud when your bait explodes off the bottom, but it's just something that allows that fish to eat that without having to go down to the bottom. So if you really do want to fish your dragging baits, or maybe you've got a lot of lay down trees or heavy cover where you need a very good weedless presentation, uh, get your bait off the bottom. Don't drag it, pop it. That's a much better approach to do. And then the last piece of advice for you in these situations would be to use baits that have some floating tendencies to them. So if you're using a jig, say, use a jig that's got a trailer that's got floating craw tentacles. That'll keep your jig in an upright position. It allows the bait to be much easier access to the fish, meaning if your bait's in a stand-up position, the fish can come down, eat the bait without having to go all the way down into the silt. Same thing goes for like a shaky head. If you want to fish a shaky head, use one that's got a worm on it that's got a floating tail. That'll keep the shaky head in the upright position and therefore give the fish more bait to key in on to be able to suck it in versus really having to go down and put their nose right into the silt, because that's not what they want to do. I do feel strongly at this point in my career that fish do not like to get a full mouthful of silt. So if you can get your bait up off the bottom, whether that's using some floating plastics, whether that's using techniques like a drop shot that gets your bait up, or varying your retrieve to get your bait up off the bottom, those are all going to really help you anytime you're fishing those silty presentations. So hopefully this was helpful, guys. If some of the other viewers out there have some tips and tricks for fishing a muck bottom, please put that in the comment section so we can learn from you guys as well. Otherwise, if you enjoyed today's video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, we'll have a new video coming out tomorrow.